Thanks for joining us for our event tonight, Questioning the Science of the Gender Industry. We have three wonderful speakers. First, you're going to hear from Helena. And Helena is a detransitioned young woman who identified as transgender during her teenage years and was eventually prescribed testosterone shortly after she turned 18. After being on testosterone for a year and a half, she realized that transitioning was a misguided way of dealing with her social and emotional struggles. Now, years later, she is interested in exploring the cultural and psychological factors that contribute to the sharp rise in adolescents who identify as transgender and who choose hormone and surgical interventions and therapies. She now serves on the team of an organization, I think it's based in the United Kingdom, called GenSpec, which gives voice to parents who have gender questioning children. Then you're going to hear from Colin Wright, who's an amazing young man. He's an evolutionary biologist. He is the senior editor at the Foundation Against Intolerance and Racism, and he's also a contributing editor to Quillette. His writing has been published in outlets such as the Wall Street Journal. He has a great piece like a week ago on the whole pronoun debate, using pronouns. His writings have also appeared in Quillette, The Times, and many more other outlets. He also writes articles for his own website and has a weekly newsletter that he sends out. His website is Reality's Last Stand, which is dedicated to keeping the public informed on the sex and gender debate. And finally, you'll hear from Dr. Michael Laidlaw, who is an endocrinologist from Rockland, California. Dr. Laidlaw has been specializing in the diagnosis and treatment of gland and hormone disorders for over 16 years. He's written articles on the topic of medical harms relating to gender dysphoria treatment and has been published both in medical journals as well as lay publications. He's spoken on the topic of the medical harms for hormones and surgical procedures in a number of venues, including state legislatures, as well as in Washington, D.C. and the UK Parliament. He's mostly off of social media, thanks to Twitter, kind of doing what Twitter does, but retains a YouTube channel that's called M. Laidlaw, his last name. So you can follow. Helen is very active on Twitter as well as Colin is very active on Twitter, and Dr. Laidlaw is on his YouTube channel. So without that, I'm going to allow the speakers to speak. Helena will go first, followed by Colin. Then Dr. Laidlaw will speak, and then I will gather up all your cards quietly and sift through them, and we'll have a really good Q&A time so that you guys can all have an opportunity to interact with our speakers. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. My name is Helena. I'm 23 now, but like she said, as a teenager, I identified as transgender. I spent a total of 5 years of my life identifying as transgender and a year and a half actually taking a testosterone injection. So also, like she mentioned, there's been a sharp rise in adolescents, especially adolescent girls identifying as transgender. And in the kind of mainstream medical world, even put forward by very serious medical organizations, there's this idea that people who identify as transgender, they have a gender identity that doesn't align with their sex assigned at birth, and that if you don't affirm this belief and then prescribe medical and surgical interventions, that these people will be at risk for mental health damages and suicidality and all this kind of stuff. And I, as having been someone who identified as transgender for a long time, I'm here to kind of give you another perspective on that, because my experience is something that is shared by a lot of the adolescent girls who are going through this. I don't know how many people are aware of this, but before about 10 or so years ago, the majority of gender dysphoria cases were diagnosed mainly in adult men and prepubescent boys. But now the most diagnosed gender dysphoria cases are in adolescent girls. So I can get into my story. When I was a child, I didn't have any kind of pronounced issue with gender. I was fine being a girl. I liked girly stuff. I'm sure there was boy stuff that I liked too, but I never had a problem when my parents would buy me dresses or, buy me makeup sets or whatever. I loved Barbies. I liked all that stuff. I got along with other girls for the most part when I was little. So nobody really would have pegged me as being a future transgender person. So how did I come to identify as transgender? And how are so many hundreds and thousands of young girls just like me coming to identify as transgender? For me, that answer lies in social contagion. And that social contagion is really found online. And for me, that was on a website called Tumblr. Tumblr, for those who don't know, is called a microblogging platform. It's really where people come, they make an account, and they can post about whatever interests they have. And on Tumblr, the majority of people come there to post about something called fandom, which is basically, if you like a movie or a TV show, when you go and meet up with other people who are interested in that thing, that would be called the fandom. So for me, my first fandom that I got into online was actually weirdly classic rock. Not a very popular one for teenage girls in the 2000s. I was really obsessed with Elvis and the Beatles. I was a total weirdo. Most other girls did not want to be friends with me at this point because I had an entire wall in my room with just printed out cutouts of pictures of Elvis and the Beatles. It was people would come to my house and be like, "What is wrong with you?" So I actually did find some other young girls who were into this same topic that I was into, classic rock, but I had to find them online. So one day I was just kind of searching up pictures of Elvis, and I found this website called Tumblr, and people are posting pictures I've never seen before, and I'm going on their accounts, and it's all saying I'm 14, I'm 15, and so I'm like, wow, this is crazy. There's all these other young girls who are just like me. So I made an account and people started following me back. I made friends right away. It was so easy to finally be able to just be myself and talk to these other young girls and not have to worry oh, they're gonna think I'm weird. Oh, I don't know anything about what they like. I'm not gonna fit in. I was just super easily able to make friends. And that just kind of became my whole world. I really stopped trying to make friends in the real world. I stopped really engaging in school. My academic performance really plummeted because I would just sit in the back of the class and just be texting people from Tumblr all day at school. But in a sense, it was good because I was able to find other people who were like me. But the thing about Tumblr is that it's long been known for being very into a certain kind of political worldview. Some people know it as social justice ideology, or a very prominent feature of that would be gender ideology. So in order to really maintain those relationships that I found on Tumblr that had become so important to me, I really had to subscribe to this new worldview. And if I can describe this worldview for you guys, it can be boiled down to seeing people as groups of identities, and all of these identities are placed on a hierarchy of most privileged, which is a bad thing, and most oppressed, which is kind of a very sympathetic thing. And so if the further you are on the oppressed spectrum, the more your voice is considered as valid or serious, the more you're listened to, the more positivity you're going to experience from other people. All sorts of things. It's really, people really go out of their way to listen to how you feel and to cater to how you feel and to be kind to you. Whereas if you are on the more privileged side of the spectrum, you really get the opposite. People feel they have the right to be mean to you because you are benefiting from these societal systems. So you need to kind of be taken down a peg. That's really how people see the world. And so if you are a privileged person, which I would be as a white, cisgender, heterosexual girl, there was just a lot of negativity. So I was faced with this kind of trade-off of, okay, so I finally found this place where I fit in, when in the real world, I really didn't feel like I fit in. I was going through a really hard time. I had just terrible emotional struggles I was going through. So I was faced with that positive aspect of this social community. And then on the other hand, this new social community had this belief system that was very prominent where everything about me was bad. Like, I was from an upper middle class family, that's terrible. I'm white, that's terrible. I was cisgender, that's terrible. I'm straight, that's terrible. And so over time, as you kind of like stew in this community, you start to think to yourself, like, God, like, I just wish that I could be in this oppressed category, because then people wouldn't be so mean to me all the time. And you start to think, you get this kind of like nagging voice in your head that's like, well, what if, I could be trans? And it's not really like a conscious thing that you're thinking. You're not thinking, I'm going to be trans to game the system. You're just thinking like, you're seeing other people, they're saying, oh, I'm they, them, or I'm she, they. And you're like, am I really all that different from that person who's they, them? Maybe I'm not. Maybe I am a they, them too, because, we are really similar in X, Y, Z, different types of ways. And then so that's exactly what I did. I just started with just changing my pronouns. It wasn't like I woke up one day and decided I'm going to be a boy. It was, I'm going to change my pronouns. And that's what I did. And immediately I got the positivity I wanted. People were just coming at me, posting, saying, so glad that you are being yourself and you're coming out and you're being trans. And immediately I was allowed to talk about issues that were important on Tumblr from a marginalized perspective. And so that just immediately transformed me from like this evil, terrible, disgusting bigot who deserves to be, ridiculed and mocked and made fun of, to someone who's now marginalized. So that was very nice. And now that I understood this kind of subconsciously, I started looking for new reasons, new ways to justify being trans. So I started kind of combing through my life and my history and thinking like, okay, so I really don't like my body and I feel really uncomfortable with my body. Maybe that's because I wasn't meant to be a girl, because that's how trans people feel, right? They don't like their bodies. So I thought that. I also thought it's always been really hard for me to make friends. Maybe that's because I just can't make friends as a girl. Maybe I'm not being authentic, so people are picking up on that and they're not being friends with me because I'm not living as my authentic self. And so I started just kind of combing through everything really thoroughly, obsessively, trying to interpret everything as a sign that I was actually trans. And this was kind of a 2-year-long process, to the point where after doing this for 2 years, I got to the point where I actually thought to myself, I'm 100% trans, I want to be a boy. This explains everything about me. And the only way for me to be happy is to transition. Because there's also all of these messages in these spaces that, if you're struggling and you're trans, all of your struggles are because you're trans. And once you transition, all of that will be better. Your life will be amazing. You'll finally feel good about yourself. You'll finally feel comfortable in your body. You'll be so confident. You'll make friends. Like, this is just everywhere. And so that's genuinely what I thought. I had the most unrealistic expectations. If somebody would have talked to me for 10 minutes and asked, what are your expectations? What are you looking to get? If they would have saw what I was writing on Tumblr about what I thought my life would be like, they would have seen that this is the fantasy of a teenage girl who's struggling. But that's not what happened. Nobody asked me those questions. Nobody wanted to get to know what was going on in my life and what I was thinking and what my rationale was. From other adults, like in the school system or eventually in the medical system, I was met with just immediate affirmation. Yes, you're trans. Yes, your parents are transphobic. Yes, we're going to help you transition. Yes, you need to transition. And so that's exactly what happened. When I turned 18, I made the decision that I was going to transition. And I did this by going to what's called an informed consent clinic. An informed consent is basically a model of care where you turn up, you sign a piece of paper, and they give you your hormones, and sometimes increasingly surgeries. People have this idea that it's like, oh, you need to go through all sorts of testing and therapy, and then you get your hormones. No. I got my hormones on one less than an hour-long session at Planned Parenthood. So yeah, I turned up, I signed their piece of paper, I talked to a social worker for about 20 minutes, and then they said I was the perfect candidate for testosterone. And so I got my first injection on that day at this Planned Parenthood clinic. And another fun aspect of this story is that when we sat down to actually figure out what my dosage was, and this is just goes to show what the standard of care is for this population of these young teenage girls who are confused. When I sat down to talk about the dosage, she wanted to start me off, the nurse practitioner wanted to start me off on a lower dose, because that's kind of what you're supposed to do. The official guidelines for this kind of stuff, it tells you to start at a lower dosage and then work up if you need to, although I don't know how they decide how you need to, because it's not whatever. So she wanted to start me off on this lower dosage, and I told her, you know, I think I have extra estrogen because I have big thighs. And this nurse practitioner, I swear to God, she said, okay, well, where would you like to start at? And I said, well, what's the highest we can go? And then she prescribed me the highest recommended dose, which is 100 milligrams of testosterone a week. That's 4 times the recommended starting dose. So right out the gate, I was on this really intensely high level of testosterone. To put that in perspective, I have friends now who still identify as trans. They are adults and they are still on testosterone, and they look like natal males. Like if one of them was sitting in this room, you would think that is a biological man. And these people are on 25 or 50 milligrams of testosterone. So I was on multiple times that dosage just right out the front gate.
A higher dose than the average male too.
Yeah.
The average biological male.
Yeah. And I was just like an 18-year-old girl. So yeah, I went on this dosage, and, you know, they just sent me on my way. It wasn't like, you know, come back in X amount of months and we'll do a blood test. They didn't even do a blood test at this appointment, mind you. It was just because you have to wait a few days for the blood test to come back. They didn't do that. I got my hormones on the very first day. So it wasn't even like, come back in a few months and we'll do test and make sure everything's going okay. Nope, they just kind of sent me on my merry way. And so I was on this dosage of testosterone for about 1.5 years. And during that time, it just took my life to a very dark place. The first kind of things I noticed on the testosterone was that I started to become really irritable. Just little things that people were doing would just kind of set me off. I didn't want to be around people. It was just, I just felt like I was kind of trapped in this cloud of just like irritability and anger and like sensitivity. And so I just kind of started isolating myself even more. At this point, I had just started college, and I didn't even want to be around these new friends that I had made. Like, I was just kind of bugging out all the time. And also, obviously, there's like the increased sex drive, and that was very overwhelming for me as like a young girl, because I feel like I had kind of a normal female sex drive, and it just, it became something that I felt like was very out of control. I didn't feel in control of my body anymore. I felt just kind of totally hijacked by both that and also the anger, which as I remained on the testosterone would increase. So it turned from just irritability and kind of bugging out all the time to anytime I felt an emotion, like something that in the past would have made me sad, just made me angry. And the anger would be so overwhelming, unlike anything I've ever felt as a girl not on testosterone. It was like, in the past, maybe I would have cried out of anger. I know I do that all the time. When I get really angry, I start to cry. Or maybe I would have gone as far as to slam a door. That's maybe the furthest I would have gone. But on testosterone, when I would get angry, I was overwhelmed with the urge to just hit something or throw something or break something. And it was terrifying to me. And mind you, at this time, I didn't understand that it was the testosterone causing this. I thought that I was just like a weird, bad person. It was really damaging to just like my self-esteem and my ability to like myself. I thought that I was this evil, angry person. And so it got to the point where I would just get so overwhelmed with anger. Like when I tell you this anger was so intense, I don't think biological men experience it as bad as I did, because it was just like, I would just devolve into this rage, uncontrollable rage, where I felt like I was going to explode if I didn't beat something. And so instead of hurting the people around me, I would turn to hurting myself. And it was just this horrible situation where I was literally walking around with bruises on my body from hitting myself during these rage attacks. And it got to the point where one night I was having one of these moments and I hurt myself so badly that I needed to go to the emergency room. And when I went there, they checked me into the psych hospital, and I was there for about a week. And the whole time, none of these psychiatrists or nurses or anybody even mentioned the fact that I was an 18-year-old girl on 100 milligrams of testosterone. They diagnosed me with a bunch of different mental illnesses, and they prescribed me 4 different psychiatric medications that I was supposed to take every day. And it was such a low, terrible, awful, dark point of my life. Eventually, though, I started kind of trying to pick my life back together. I got a job. I climbed out of bed, because I would just literally lay in bed all day in between having meltdowns. I would just lay in bed all day hating myself. And so I tried to pick myself up, and as I kind of, started talking to people again, and I had a lot of time on my own because I worked a pretty solitary job and I had some time to just reflect on my life, I started to think like, this is not matching up with what I thought, what my fantasy was when I was a teenager, when I was being told like, oh, you're going to live your authentic self and you're not going to feel so bad anymore. And it's going to be so amazing just when you get on testosterone. And so I started to think like, that's not true for me. This is really just like, my life sucks. And it was like that for a few months. It was like that for a few months where I was just increasingly thinking like, this is terrible. My life is terrible. As a 13, 14, 15-year-old girl, I never thought that my life would be like this. Like, who have I become? And it all kind of culminated in one moment where someone close to me actually made a video montage that showed pictures of us from the day that we met, which was like 2 days after I started the testosterone, to very recently at that time. And it was in chronological order. So I really got to see like myself transform from this kind of like hopeful young girl to this just like really like broken looking person, honestly, just like dead look in my eyes, never smiling, bags under my eyes, deadpan face. And that's the moment when it just like really finally hit me. I was like, oh my God, all of this has been a huge mistake. Everything from that first pronoun change on Tumblr has been a massive misunderstanding and a massive mistake. And then I thought that I was the only person that this had ever happened to. I thought that I must have been insane. I thought that, I don't know, I felt really badly about myself, felt really dark and isolated again, until I started to do a little bit more research. And then I stumbled on, parent organizations and some feminist networks that were kind of talking about this being a phenomenon. And as I started reading about this, especially the parent testimonials, where specifically researcher Lisa Littman, she did a study where she talked to, I think like 150 different parents, and they were telling her about their daughters. And she found that there are these common patterns between these young girls who identify as trans, and it all has to do with pre-existing mental health issues, pre-existing social problems, heavy internet use up until the point of coming out as transgender, and then declining mental health after coming out as transgender. And I saw like, oh my God, this was totally me. And not only that, but this is everybody I know. Like, this is all of these other trans-identified young girls and boys that I know. And I took to social media because I saw that, activists were just attacking Lisa. They were coming to her school. They were getting her school that she did the research through actually took down the research for a period of time under activist pressure. And so I saw that and I was like, this is wrong. Like, she's onto something. She knows what's going on, because I'm not the only person that this has happened to. And so I took to social media and I defended her research and I talked about my story, and I was able to meet other young women that this has happened to. I was able to meet other parents, and I've talked to so many parents at this point, and it's just like carbon copies. Like, I feel like their daughters are like me. Like, they're the same, it's the same kind of type of girl that this is happening to. And usually it's these bright, intelligent, artistic, creative girls who they have a hard time in high school, because high school is freaking rough when you're a little bit different and you struggle socially. So it's just like these amazing girls, and this is happening where it's just derailing their lives, it's harming their health, and the whole medical establishment is just like cheering it on. And I'm just seeing these young girls be destroyed, and boys too, but it's a lot of girls. I'm just seeing them be destroyed. So that's where I'm coming from. That's my story. That's how I transitioned and detransitioned. And I'm just here to say that what the mainstream narrative about transgenderism is saying is not right. There's so much going on under the surface. They don't know about the social media. They don't know about this political ideology stuff that's going on. And honestly, I don't think they care. So I don't think people who don't care should be given this kind of authority over the medical care for these vulnerable, unique young girls. So.
If I could just add real quick, she has an amazing Substack that she released last week.
Yeah.
Which really has this whole story,
Yeah,
and,
the whole
and a lot
story.
of pictures and the actual forms that she
The
filled
medical
out.
records, yeah.
Yeah, at the clinic, and it's and you know, somebody pretty famous retweeted your story today. So, you know, like,
Under what?
Oh, it's a weird spelling. How can we? I don't know. I don't think you guys will remember it if I spell it out to you. It's a kind of a weird name. You know what it is? Okay, you'll tell it. But maybe Lisa or Jennifer, maybe we can.
we can let you all know.
Yeah, we can write it down for everyone so they can take it home and.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Colin.
That was amazing.
Yeah.
Thank you for telling your story.
Thank you.
Wow. So I'm coming at this from a very different perspective and a very different trajectory. So I guess I'll just explain a little bit how I got to where I am today, and sort of where I think we are in the whole discussion about sex and gender. So in 2018, I was in academia. I'm an evolutionary biologist. I was applying for jobs in academia as a professor. I was then I was a postdoc at Penn State. And I sort of noticed a little shift in the way that my friends and colleagues were talking about issues of sex and gender. Maybe in the early 2010s, people were telling me to accept the fact that gender and sex were very different things, that you could be, your sex was either male or female, but that your gender, which they would describe as man or woman, was more of the social aspects of sex, or it's a type of identity. And that's something that I sort of thought was okay. I'll take that. As long as there's this sharp line between what your biology is and what you identify as, you know, we can have different words for different types of concepts. So I was largely on board with that shift. And then this sort of line became more and more blurry, where people were, it was just my friends on Facebook who were talking about identifying as male or a female. And I was like, wait, I thought man and woman were the identity terms and sex was and male and female were the sex terms. And then in around 2018, I had some friends, and these were PhD students in anthropology departments. They were biologists. And they would start posting things on their social media like articles that there are 6 sexes, or that sex is a spectrum and a social construct, or you know, there's 10 sexes. I think that's the biggest number I saw was 10. And for me, I was coming at this at a purely scientific angle. I was just, these people are confused about what sex means. You know, they think that just because, you know, someone has a different chromosomal arrangement, maybe you have Klinefelter syndrome, you're like XYY or something, that means you're this new sex, even though these are subsets of males. And so they were basically talking about these different chromosomal arrangements as being each of these unique sexes. And so I was just, I was inadvertently walking into this landmine that I didn't know that was sitting there for me. And so I would just respond like, oh, this is not correct. This is just scientifically inaccurate. And I was always very kind. I'm just trying to set the record straight about, there's just some confusion here. People are wrong about certain facts, and I'll just supply the right information, and that'll clear everything up. That wasn't the case. And so the response that I got to these weren't that, oh, that's not correct, this is what I was expecting. Like, the reason I got into academia was so I could have discussions about academic issues and things like that. But the response wasn't an academic response. It was just, you're a transphobe, you're a bigot. People would just start piling on me, like, oh, as a cis white heterosexual male, all these things. It's like, what does this have to do with whether or not all these different chromosomal arrangements are sexes? So like, it was just completely out of left field. And so I kind of stopped talking about these issues because I was, on the job market. I didn't want people to put me in this category. People thought I was a horrible human being. And so I did a lot of introspection. I was like, I don't think I'm a horrible person. And then, so I kind of let it slide for a while. And then there was an article published in Nature, which is the most prestigious scientific publication that there is. And it was by someone named Claire Ainsworth. She was a biologist. And I think it was called Sex Redefined. And then the subtitle was something like, male and female are overly simplistic, and scientists now think that sex is a much larger spectrum than just male or female. And to me, that was when my social media circle, the things my friends were talking about, it just became real. Like, this isn't just some fringe thing I'm seeing in my friend circles. Like, this is in Nature. And then this was followed up by these publications in Scientific American, and they published, the sex spectrum, and they had this big diagram that showed that, here's male and female on one side, and there's all this variation in between, and they had these arrows going across the entire thing, and we've since found out that like some of these arrows, they make no sense. They like purposefully made this chart look more complex than it needed to be. And again, it was just like they just don't know what someone's sex is. They're confusing someone's secondary sexual characteristics, like the characteristics that you get when you begin going through puberty, like breast development or facial hair, or these types of things, just overall sort of the way your body looks. They're confusing that with sex, which has to do with the way your reproductive system is organized around. But these were given credibility because these are in Nature and in Scientific American. And if you question these things, then you were a complete bigot. So I wrote a couple articles for Quillette initially coming out, and this was really stressful for me to do because a lot of my close colleagues and my PhD advisor, they told me that this could be career suicide. And to me, the reason I got into academia wasn't so I could just not make any, I'm not trying to make controversial claims or anything, but I would think we should be able to freely examine ideas, and if people disagree with them, they can come back at me with data, and we can have a civilized conversation. But that was just not what was happening. And the fact that they told me, your essays that you're writing are absolutely correct, but it would be career suicide to do this. To me, that just told me, like, why do I want to be in academia again? Like, this was not what I signed up for 12 years ago when I started to major in biology and wanted to become a biologist. So that made me really, I guess, the whole idea of academia was not what it was sold as for me before. And so I started talking about these issues, and I mentioned initially how these were it was purely factual for me. But then when I got into, well, what are the implications of this whole sex denialism type of thing? And then it became clear that this isn't just a factual dispute. Like, there was enormous societal ramifications of denying just some of those fundamental aspects of one's sex. I used to argue with, people who were young Earth creationists or something like that, so who were denying evolution and things like that. And I thought it was important to acknowledge evolutionary biology. And to me, this was just like that controversy, but on steroids. It was just to deny that male and female aren't real biological categories in nature is just, it's just so wrong, and it's going to create so many problems when you try to base a society or base laws when you're just denying some fundamental aspect of biology. We can't talk about human rights. There's differences in sexes between, the things that different sexes need, or the needs and wants, and how women's rights has to do with their sex bodies rather than their pure gender identity. And so I wrote an article for the Wall Street Journal that was called The Dangerous Denial of Sex, that kind of went over how denying biological sex, how this harms women, because they're no longer able to exercise their sex-based rights if anyone can simply just identify into the category of womanhood. It's harmful to the gay and lesbian community because they're now redefining what it means to be gay and lesbian as not being same-sex attracted, but being attracted to the same gender identity. So by this logic, I would be actually pansexual because, and this is what activists told me, because I told them that I would still find Scarlett Johansson attractive if Scarlett Johansson had decided that she was a man, but otherwise changed nothing about themselves. She's attractive, but if she just happened to identify as a man, that would by definition make me homosexual then, because now she identifies as a man, and since I'm a man, I would now be gay. But then I pointed out to them that I would find her attractive if she identified as a toaster. So that means that I guess I'm pansexual because I'm attracted to all gender identities that, it doesn't matter how they identify. And so it's harmful to the gay community because of that. We can't talk about human rights issues that deal with gay issues because there's nothing that means to be gay anymore. If I fit into this category, then the category is completely useless. And then this is ultimately harmful to children, I think, and I think that your story is really speaks to that, because we're telling people now that your sex is a matter of your identity, that if you just happen to identify as a girl or a boy or a man or a woman, well, that makes you one of those things instead of, and has nothing to do with your biological sex. This is really influential to children who sort of have a simplistic way they're looking at the world. You tell them what is a man or a woman, what is a boy or a girl to a young child, and if you put a dress on a man, they'll say, oh, it's a girl all of a sudden. They're very simplistic, they'll look at stereotypes. And gender ideology ultimately is rooted in stereotypes. For the longest time, a lot of activists would deny that they're identifying what someone's gender identity is by sex stereotypes, but there are organizations now. There's one called EGALE, and this is the organization in Canada that is responsible for all the sex and gender curricula for most of their public schools in Canada. And they had a video online that I just actually recently stumbled upon. It was called Trans 101, the basics. So this is a video meant for K through 12, and it's the video that you show kids the first thing that they'll see about trans individuals. And when they talked about what does it mean to be trans, well, first they defined gender as, the way you're expected to act in society based on what's between your legs. That's a direct quote. So, sort of, if you have a penis, then society says you need to act masculine. But let's say you're a effeminate boy. Well, then by definition to them, you're transgender. And this is. People will say that I'm misquoting them. This is a direct quote from these organizations in Canada. You have these, the New York Times recently had an article that talked about men, women, and gender nonconforming people, as if to suggest that if you're gender nonconforming, then that means you're not a man or a woman. And then we see these educational tools like the genderbread person, which is something that's used not only in a lot of public schools, but also in colleges. I have college kids send me these things in their gender classes. And it very much explicitly talks about what does it mean to be a man or a woman. It talks about manness and womanness. And in the category of manness, it talks about facial hair, voice pitch, the types of jobs that you're interested in, hobbies. It's basically just talking about all these things that are correlated with being masculine. And then for women, it's female-coded type jobs and stereotypes. So they're very much just literally rooting gender ideology in what type of stereotype you are. So if you're female and you're a tomboy, you're trans. Okay, and if you're a boy and you're effeminate, you're trans. Mm-hmm. If you're sort of androgynous and you don't identify as sort of any one of these stereotypes, you're non-binary, which is a subset of being trans. This is what they're literally teaching kids nowadays. Okay, this is, in my view, this is extremely serious. And just because, you know, if this was just sort of a fad and what kids were talking about, like, they just want to identify as these labels, it wouldn't be so bad, except for the fact, as your story speaks to, is that if you're considered to have gender dysphoria, which is based on these stereotypes, this is viewed as a medical condition. Okay, this isn't just, you know, be the way you are. This is usually seen as a medical condition worthy of giving people puberty blockers, stunting their development. And we know for a fact that people who are put on puberty blockers, almost 100% of kids who go on puberty blockers, instead of buying them time to explore their gender identities, which it's always billed at, and that it's a safe and reversible thing, which it isn't, almost 100% of kids who go on puberty blockers go on to get cross-sex hormones and surgeries and continue on their transition. So it seems that these puberty blockers are actually sort of cementing their dysphoria and making them basically just putting them down this pathway for transition, as opposed to what it's billed as, which is, you know, this explore your gender journey and you can change your mind at any time. It appears to have the exact opposite effect on that. So this is a lot of what I talk about on Twitter and in articles, because, you know, this is the opposite of what I think is a liberal view of what I think a lot of the feminists had right over time. You know, we had this idea that you can be male or female, this is something biological, but that we shouldn't feel constrained if you're a woman and you feel masculine, or if you're a man and you feel feminine. You know, this is the beauty of human diversity. We have, you can express yourself in any way you see fit to. If you're a man and you want to wear dresses, you should be able to. You know, if you want to wear a pantsuit and you're a woman, you should be able. You know, there's nothing wrong with these things. Someone posted on Twitter, I think, what is the best view or the best overview of what gender ideology is teaching kids right now, and it expressed three different views. It said that sexism was the idea that that women need to do the dishes, and then you have equality that sort of came in, that a lot of the feminists were advocating for, and this view of equality was that both men or women should do the dishes. You know, this is not a specific sex thing. And then gender ideology, the last one, was this idea that whoever's doing the dishes is the woman. Yeah. And that is sort of, I think, really encapsulates what gender ideology is doing and why I think it is so toxic. It is solidifying these gender sexist stereotypes. Rather than just saying that men and women can behave however they want to, we shouldn't discriminate against people based on their innate sense of you know, their expression, their degree of masculinity or femininity. It's saying that it's basically just making these old sexist stereotypes in a way much more concrete than they've ever been. In terms of why I think this is going on, this will be the last thing I sort of mention. I think there's several different things going on. There's this problem of funding, and how you had these organizations like the Human Rights Organization, or Human Rights Campaign, ACLU, all these things. They spent a lot of money going all in on the gay rights movement, which I was very much supportive of. I was very much pro gay marriage, and they got billions and billions of dollars. These are big organizations fighting for a cause which I viewed was a just cause. In 2015, that's when gay marriage became the law of the land. And you can see that right after that happened, the messaging that they had switched from gay rights to now funding all these billions of dollars into the trans issue. And this is sort of a problem with these big organizations. You know, these organizations are founded upon this idea that they're going to defeat some evil. But when they're big enough and they're so huge that they are so influential that they do beat that evil, well, what do you expect them to do now? Are they just going to turn the lights off and, you know, we can go home now? Well, no, they have to find this other evil. And if there's no other evil that's as bad as the one that they're trying to combat, they have to make them. They have to just create these problems and create these issues that they need to then usher in and insist that they have the solution for these things. So right now we have this full court press on on transgender issues and gender ideology. And when they want to find out, what are the ideology that they want to start pushing, well, now you have this problem of, well, they go to academia to see what are the theories coming out of there, and they go to, well, let's talk about the gender studies departments. Well, these are the credential, the credentializing institutions, these universities. So they go to the people who are scholars in gender, and they just happen to be taking on this ideology that I mentioned, where your gender is based completely on stereotypes. But this is given the veneer of credibility because these are what these scholars who have PhDs are writing. And so who else are you going to go to? Like, these are the quote-unquote experts. And so this is what their funding is based on. This is what these organizations are going with. And then the last aspect of it is an environment of fear that's now attached to this, because for a long time it didn't look very good to be on the opposite end of the rainbow flag. If you were anti-gay marriage, you're seen as some backwards person who's against progress. And I think that the gay rights movement was very, very positive. And it's just instilled in a lot of people's minds now that the rainbow flag means good. These are good people who want human rights, who are trying to fight for the equal rights of everybody. This is a good movement. And so they're using this sort of rainbow flag as a shield, basically, for their current movement, where someone like me were to speak out against these movements, even though I had nothing but support for them previously. Since I'm now criticizing this organization, these the rainbow banners, I'm now seen as this far-right, alt-right, terrible Nazi. I've been called everything for doing that. And this creates a culture of fear among people who speak out against these things, especially in academia, which is very skewed to the left on things. I spoke up a little bit on this, and I was immediately hammered by people. People went after me on Twitter. They were tagging in Penn State. They were contacting all the diversity departments. Students at my university said that they felt unsafe because I was on campus and that I was going to attack them or something. And I merely just talked about how sex is real and that it matters in certain contexts. That's literally all I said in these pieces. And people are feeling unsafe, so they're sort of weaponizing this sort of ideology to make people be quiet. I had a colleague that who I wrote academic papers with. They were my co-author on papers. I studied spiders and wasps and ant behavior, their social behavior, and we were co-authors on these papers. We were best buddies in high school and grad school. And he messaged me. He sent me a text message saying that a lot of people my colleagues are questioning why I'm have co-authored papers with you on wasps and spiders because of your views on sex and gender, and that he needed to then go on Twitter and denounce me. He told me that he was going to do this, and I'm fine with people criticizing my ideas, if I'm my scientific ideas and the things I say, but it was the social policing of his colleagues, that he felt that this was a threat to his career if he didn't totally pan me as some bigot for just saying that sex is real and these things. So this is that environment of fear that is keeping people from being quiet. So I've worked hard to get myself to a place where I'm uncancelable, so I can talk about these issues in a way that I want to, and I've been surprisingly successful at doing that. So I think this is sort of where we are now. Luckily, people are becoming more and more aware of the problem, and although there's still a lot of fear that people have for speaking up, the more that are speaking up kind of create this environment where it's less risky for any single individual. And so I think it's a slow snowballing process. I think it's really starting to roll now. We're in a much better place than we were in 2018 when I first started talking about these things. So I have a lot of optimism, and yeah, that's the end of what I have to say about that. So. I've been too long, sorry.
Okay, thank you for that, both the great speakers. Thank you all for being here. I want to differ with my colleague here a little bit and say that I believe there are 14,864 and a third different sexes. Just kidding. There's actually, how many? Two different sexes? Male, female? Two. That's right. Okay. I'm back on track. Tonight, I'll talk a bit about some background, how I got into this, some development, how we develop our reproductive systems, hormones and surgeries and their dangers for this condition, and a bit about what we can do about this. Now, I first got involved in this topic. I'm an endocrinologist. I specialize in gland and hormone treatments, medical doctor in Rockland. In our city, they were reading this book you may have heard of called I Am Jazz to the kids, first grade, I want to say. And parents became quite outraged when they realized there was transgender propaganda in a children's book being told to their children without their knowledge. So I started to look into this. A parent actually said, you really need to look at this from the perspective of an endocrinologist and see what you think. And so I ended up writing about it. It's a nicely illustrated book geared towards kids, but I found a lot of falsehoods there and a lot of information that was missing. For example, Jazz is diagnosed by a doctor at a very young age as being transgender. Is that a diagnosis that a kid can have? Is it even a diagnosis? Jazz is told he had a girl brain and a boy body. Is that possible? Is that physically possible? And what was missing was, what are all the harms if one goes down this pathway? We've heard some of them tonight, for hormones, for surgeries, for transitioning. So I wrote a letter to my school board saying, hey, these are all the problems that I see. Why don't we talk about dangers of these hormones, dangers of surgeries, and so forth? And this ended up getting published, and I've gone on to speak about it. So I'll talk about, think about this question. Can a man become a female? Can that happen scientifically? Can a boy change into a woman? Can a girl later become a man? Everything we do is based on, or many things we do are based on a philosophy. For example, in medicine, we have a philosophy of first do no harm. And that's the idea that we're going to do, hopefully whatever treatment you give gives more benefit than harm. It certainly doesn't harm people. There's also a thought process or a philosophy behind gender ideology, as I see it. In 2017, there was a complaint, Drew Adams versus School Board of St. John's, Florida. And there, a transgender identifying student wanted to use opposite restrooms and locker rooms. And here's the most dangerous statement that came out of this lawsuit that I could see. They said that gender identity is a person's core internal sense of their own gender, how you feel about your gender. I think that's okay. But they said that this is the primary factor in determining one's sex. So how you feel about your gender determines your sex. Therefore, if you feel like a woman, you can go ahead as a man and enter women's locker rooms or be housed in women's prisons or join the women's lacrosse team or swim team, so forth. Or a girl can go ahead and go into the boys' locker room. Or anyone is entitled, even young kids, to go on and change their sexual organs to match their internal gender identity. Now, there is I believe, an actual condition called gender dysphoria, and Helena described it well today. Feeling like there's a mismatch between the internal sense of what your gender is and your physical body, which leads to distress and impairment. I believe that's a real condition. Most kids who are diagnosed with this at a young age will grow out of this condition if you let them alone and don't give them puberty blockers, as Colin was saying. Most teens will also probably grow out of this, although the experts are saying that they never grow out of it, but they have no evidence for that in their books. They refer to references from 2003, which don't prove that. Many adults also grow out of this. And there's a website, Walt Heyer, transgenderregret.com, where many people have come to him and said after something like 10 years, they regret what they've done. They regretted the hormones, they regretted things that they've done. As the speakers were saying earlier, there's been a very large increase in referrals for gender identity services. In the UK, it was a 4,400% increase over the last decade. Many more girls than boys, as Helena was saying. Many of them come with issues already. The Finnish Gender Identity Service said that 75% of their adolescents already had comorbid psychiatric conditions, anxiety, depression, or other things like that. 26% had autism. Many were already seen in the service for other psychiatric issues even before being diagnosed with gender dysphoria. What about adults? The biggest survey that you can find is in Sweden, where they tracked people over 30 years, people who had had surgeries and hormones, and found if you look at the survival curve compared to the population, many people are living, and then at around 10 years, it drops off rapidly for the people who've had these treatments. And why is that? Much of it has to do with suicide. They found a 19 times increased risk of suicide, death from suicide. And then many more people were being committed inpatient to psychiatric institutions. Elena was inpatient from these types of treatments. That's not surprising. Now, I'll go into some background about biology and development and then medications. So as we said earlier, there are only two sexes. You can prove it to yourself. You think about it mentally, go back to when you first originated as a single cell organism. You were one single cell, and then go back a little further. There was a sperm and there was an egg, which came from a man and a woman. And it came together to make you as a person. And every single person on earth can say the same exact thing that happened to them. So there's only two sexes. Now, go forward. What happens during development, say from around weeks 8 to 12? There are, without getting too complicated, little tubules in your body that develop one way or another. The Wolffian ducts and the Mullerian ducts. The Wolffian ducts go on to make male organs like seminal vesicles, vas deferens. The Mullerian ducts go on to make uterus, fallopian tubes, a portion of the vagina, the cervix. And importantly, once you begin down one pathway, those other little tubules are destroyed, they're obliterated, and vice versa. And so you can't switch from one track to the other. It starts very early in development. Now, what happens when you're born? When you're born, a young child, even a 4-year-old, could identify, oh, mommy, that's a boy. He's got this, that's a girl. But what's interesting, I find, is that you're born with a functioning heart. Your lungs start functioning, exchanging oxygen, carbon dioxide. Your kidneys are filtering things out. But your reproductive tract system is quiet for the most part. There's a little bit of hormones coming out, but they really don't change and start their function until what time period? Puberty. Is puberty a disease, by the way? No, it's not a disease. It's a normal part of life. In fact, you've all been through puberty, but if some young person hasn't been through puberty, there's a medical condition, and an endocrinologist or some other doctor needs to figure out what it is and treat it. Sometimes this is due to damage to a gland in the brain called the pituitary gland, the master gland. It controls other glands. It controls testicles to make testosterone. It controls ovaries to make estrogen. If this is damaged, this is another long word, we call it hypogonadotropic hypogonadism. It means this isn't functioning to tell these sex organs to make their hormones. Now, we actually have medications that can cause the same condition. Why would you want to do that? Well, some kids start development too early, say age 5. They start developing their glands, their breast tissue, their penis, they develop hair, and it's too early. So we call that precocious puberty, early puberty. You can give this medication, halt this pubertal development, and then stop the medication, say they're 11 or 12, something like that, and allow them to go through normal development. So here you have an abnormal condition, and you're waiting for a period of time and letting normal puberty happen. What about with gender dysphoria? What happens when you give a 12-year-old or even an 8-year-old puberty blockers? You're causing a medical condition. You're causing the same condition I described. You're taking a normally developing person and making it a medical problem that didn't exist before. Are there problems with this? Sure there are. As you can imagine, the person doesn't develop sexually. They're not going to have normal sexual function. They're going to be infertile. They may be sterilized if they go on, like most of them do, like Colin said, to cross-sex hormones and surgeries. You're going to disrupt normal brain development. You're going to disrupt bone development. Bone increases in density, becomes very strong, mainly during those adolescent years. And if you stop that, it's going to flatline this process, and they're going to be at risk for osteoporosis and fractures, I believe, when they're older. You know, if you look at the labeling of puberty blockers, it actually says expect possible side effects of mood changes, depression, anxiety. And we know these kids already have this for the most part going into it. And I underline this for myself. It says monitor for development of worsening psychiatric symptoms. Use with caution in patients with a history of psychiatric illness. Does that sound like something that's good to do to kids? I would say no. I'd like to move on to cross-sex hormones, or what I like to call wrong-sex hormones. Now, if you think about, and Lena gave a great description, personal description of what happened to her. Females mainly make estrogen. We also call it estradiol, but make some smaller proportion of testosterone. Okay, if the normal range that I'm looking at all the time is around 10 to 50, okay? Now, some women have a condition like PCOS, if you've ever heard of that, and their numbers might be higher, like 100, 150, and they can develop metabolic abnormalities, irregular menses, infertility. There are endocrine tumors which can produce hundreds and hundreds, up to 1,000 on that level. So we treat those, and many times those women need surgery. Now, what are they recommending? She gave some doses, but what are they recommending to get the levels to for so-called trans girls to become boys? 300 to 1,000. That's 6 to 100 times higher than the normal physiologic level. That can cause a lot of problems, as we've heard. Now, there's a number of physical problems. They've shown a 3 to 4-fold increased risk of myocardial infarction for these trans people. Erythrocytosis, which is very high red blood cell counts, that's a risk factor for cardiovascular disease and death. Severe liver dysfunction can happen, hypertension, cancers of the ovaries, breast. And of course, hair growth on the face, which if you regret later is very difficult to remove. Could be a deepening of the voice, which I don't know if there's a remedy for that actually. They think it's wonderful while they're enjoying their manhood, but what about all of the regretters? What can they do about that later? What about estrogen for males? Now, these are also being given in high doses. A lot of it's kind of, they don't track the numbers, I don't know as well, but I've talked to some men about this who've had it. If a normal dose of estrogen that we might give to women for hormone replacement is, say, 1 or 2 milligrams, these boys and men are getting 3 milligrams, 4 milligrams, 8 milligrams, or more. Many-fold increase. What's the problem there? Well, they've shown an increased risk, of course, of myocardial infarction, death due to cardiovascular disease, thromboembolism, which is blood clots that can go to the lungs and can be deadly, 5 times increased risk. Stroke, 2 times increased risk. Gallstones. Some small proportion of men do develop breast cancer. You may have heard, it's like 0.1%. On this estrogen, they've found it's 46 times above normal for breast cancer risk. And of course, there's breast tissue creation, we call it gynecomastia, that really shouldn't be there for men, and can be debilitating in its own way if again, a man decides, I made a mistake, I didn't want to do this. Now they have to have a very major painful surgery, costly surgery, to remove that, so they're not mistaken as a woman at a grocery store, for example, which one of my friends told me about happened to him. And of course, there's no FDA approval for any of these treatments that I've said. There's no long-term studies about it. There's no safety. It's the Wild West. Now, I'd like to talk about surgeries a little bit for this condition. Now, I've thought that, sat and thought about it a bit. If you think about it conceptually, surgery, for the most part, or at least some component, is a subtractive process. We're removing something, right? You have an inflamed gallbladder with gallstones, you have to have it taken out, subtracted, removed. You have inflamed, infected appendix, it has to be removed. Sometimes you subtract or remove something like a heart valve and put in a replacement, swap it out. But following along the theme of a subtractive process, how much of a woman do you need to subtract to create a man? Like if you remove one breast, are you halfway to manhood? Or two breasts? Or that's not enough. Now we're going to remove the ovaries and the vagina and the uterus and the fallopian tubes. Now are you at manhood? Well, what can they do? Well, they can fashion a new organ for you, right? Can a surgeon create a penis that wasn't there before? Or what are they doing? They're removing skin and muscle from the forearm or leg and rolling it up and putting a tube in there and saying that that's a penis. And there's problems with that. There's strictures of the urethra. There can be infection. There can be chronic pain. If you remove breasts, will the nipple continue to function? Can you ever breastfeed again if you regret that? Can you get breasts back? Like one of our esteemed researchers, Johanna Olsen Kennedy, said, well, you can just get it back later in life, right? Wrong. You order it from Amazon, maybe? I don't think so. What about for males? Well, you subtract out a penis, turn it inside out, maybe connect a portion of colon to it and call it female reproductive system. Does that sound right? Does that function in any way like a normal female reproductive tract? I would say no. So to sort of sum up some things and have a closing thought, a male can never become a female, nor can a female become a male. We do not have the technology for that. We don't know any long-term outcomes, particularly for kids, but we know a little bit from Sweden that it wasn't good for adults. Medications are being used off-label without FDA risk assessment profile. This is an experiment on kids and adults and young people. The NIH, I didn't get into this too much, but they're allowing this unethical research. Can you believe they allowed for 8-year-old girls to get testosterone? We had to find that out through Freedom of Information Act requests from the NIH. And we're ignoring desisters, people who have been through this, people like we have here. We're ignoring their voices, and I think they're the most important voices. How can kids and adults be helped? Well, investigate the things that we talked about. Do they have autism? Are they having problems with anxiety, social situations, marital conflict, interpersonal conflict? In some small cases, maybe sexual abuse or some type of harm in the home. What can we do in education and government? We'll be here tonight, put on programs like this, speak out, talk to your teachers, talk to your school boards, talk to your governor, talk to the United Nations, whoever you can talk about, let them know about the dangers of this therapy. And we don't really know well, we can guess what the risks are. I just told you what they are. And don't give up. I want to make one final concluding thought about jazz. I started with jazz. Has anyone seen the program or familiar with the I Am Jazz? Okay, I saw a picture of jazz at age 21. I don't know if anyone's seen this. There was like kind of a before and after. There's a teen kind of fashion-looking jazz, and then there's a very overweight, obese probably, jazz with like a cutoff shirt and huge stretch marks across the abdomen. And Jazz was saying that he's being fat shamed by his family. And we know that Jazz, if I recollect, was supposed to go to Harvard, I think, and then because of problems with depression, surprise, couldn't make it to Harvard. Now, Jazz said on an earlier show before the surgery, when they asked about sexual function, is I don't have any sexual function. I don't have any kind of orgasm. Do you think the hormones and surgeries that he had corrected that situation? It doesn't. It doesn't. Is Jazz sterilized now? Yes, according to what I can tell. So you have a sterilized person, you have someone without sexual function, someone who can't seem to function at home, sadly. And I don't mean to pick on Jazz. I feel sorry for Jazz. I mean, he just happens to be the person that they've held up as an example in our schools and school books and on television. I feel nothing but sympathy for Jazz and people like him. But we have to look and say, if this is the premier person who you're exhibiting, what's happened to him? What's going to happen to him? I feel very bad about what's happened to Jazz. It's interesting too, when I looked at that picture of Jazz, and take a look at it if you can find it. Do you see the face of a young woman? I see the face of a boy, and it could be my perception, but we were taught in endocrinology that people who have pituitary disorders at a young age often have a childlike face as they get older. I saw a person like this. They were 30. They looked like, kind of had a boyish 12-year-old face. Never forgot it. And I saw Jazz, I'm like, this is the same thing over again, because they've assaulted his pituitary and shut it off, and then pumped him full of wrong sex hormones, and then paraded him around on television. And the results are very sad. I wish the best for him. I wish the best for all these kids. But that's about what I have to say. Thank you very much for having me.
I would like to collect your cards. Joey, where are you, Joey? She's in the kitchen. Yeah.
Thank you. You too.
Somebody help me with the cards.
Yeah, great job. You too.
That's great. Thank you.
Now I can relax. Now we can go out next week. Get that out of the way.
Dr. Laidlaw, while we're waiting, can you talk momentarily about problematic chromosomal structures, the XXYs and so forth, that wind up with hermaphrodite kinds of properties at times?
It's up to the organizer.
Go right ahead.
Okay.
Yep, time to fill.
I don't want to interfere with it. Okay. I mean, there are a small portion, I think you even had the number, 0.02% with problems of sexual development. I don't believe there's a gender spectrum. I believe that there's a difficulty with development going up. Many of them you can figure out what their sex is or gender is scientifically. I think there are very unusual conditions like where the person, testicular effeminization, if you've heard of that, where the body's cells cannot accept testosterone, and therefore someone who has XX chromosomes could end up, XY chromosomes can end up as a female. I think that's possible. I didn't want to get too into that, but someone would say, well, chromosomes are 100% of what make your sex. I would actually disagree with that, and sometimes it isn't. There's several parts to it. There's chromosomes, there's that developmental part, like I talked about early on in embryology, and then there's puberty, which ultimately determine your sex.
So I'm going to ask the first question, which could be anybody who knows the answer to this, because I don't know it. Who is ultimately paying for all of these treatments and surgeries? The insurance companies? Who's paying for all this? If you show up, like who paid for your?
I paid out of pocket. I know that in the United States, at least, a lot of insurers are covering it at this point. Some people pay out of pocket, and then if neither are an option, there are also organizations that will give grants. Like, for example, I even considered applying to an organization that would give me a grant for a mastectomy, which I thankfully never ended up having. But there are organizations out there that will do that. I just, was already kind of having doubts by that point, so I never applied to this organization. But I knew other young women who had applied to this organization, had mastectomies through them. So there's really, in the United States at least, there's not really one main way that people go about it.
I think a lot of it is through insurance.
Yeah.
But then I think there are, if I'm not mistaken, like tens of thousands of GoFundMe accounts right now for double mastectomies for young girls who think they're trans. So it's crowdfunded, but it's also through insurance companies as well.
Now more than ever, insurance companies are covering it. A few years ago, it wasn't this much, but now almost every single one covers it.
Dr. Laidlaw, what causes puberty in the normal person?
What causes puberty?
What causes puberty?
That's a good question. Well, I don't think they 100% know. There's some degree of fat tissue development actually that signals the pituitary that it's time to wake up from its sleep and start signaling either the testicles or the ovaries to start producing more of their hormone. And so when those levels begin to rise, that's really what initiates and propagates puberty for those next several years.
Colin, what's behind all the pronoun stuff? Like, why is that so in vogue?
Yeah.
Since you wrote about it in the Wall Street Journal recently.
Yeah. So I was receiving a lot of questions about pronouns because it's just a practice that's depending on where you are in society. If you're at a university, you probably hear a lot about this stuff, where they want people to ask for pronouns basically on every type of introduction you have. The Human Rights Campaign recently tweeted that you should begin every conversation with, "Hi, my name is Colin. My pronouns are he, him. What are yours?" And besides, apart from that just being extremely annoying and everything, I actually wrote a piece, talked about this is actually sort of a Trojan horse for gender ideology, the notion that whether you're a man or woman is not determined by your sex at all, but is determined by your identity. Because they refer to someone's pronouns, if you're he, him, since they believe that whether or not you're a man or a woman is defined by stereotypes, even though if someone asks you your pronouns, and let's say if I said I'm he, him, even though I may be responding he, him because I think, because I'm a biological male, and that's why I use those pronouns. If you talk to someone, if you say that to someone who is into this whole idea of gender ideology, they're not hearing that I'm he, him because I'm a male. To them, you're admitting that you are identifying with these social expectations and stereotypes of masculinity, basically. And so my point was that we shouldn't really respond unless if you don't agree with gender ideology, don't respond with your pronouns. Say, you can call me by my name, or I'm not comfortable sharing my pronouns, or I disagree with the ideology that's producing that question. Because you don't want to just be working within their ideology. If you're just going to respond saying, oh, he, him, just to avoid the awkward situation, it avoids an awkward situation, but it actually helps promulgate this ideology because you're operating within their words. I made an analogy that it's kind of like, imagine we had the American Astrological Society that was in control of had a lot of institutional power for whatever reason. And they recommended that you begin every conversations with, hi, I'm a Sagittarius, what's your sign? If you don't agree with astrology, if you think it's just pseudoscience, which I happen to believe, if you're responding, say like, oh, I'm a Virgo, you might be saying I might say I'm a Virgo because I was born in August, but they might be hearing that, oh, you believe that all the star sign stuff and that it's affecting your birth, and this is a major aspect of your personality. And so you can kind of see how you'd be operating within this ideology of assuming astrology is true. And you're kind of doing the same thing, I think, if you're just responding with your he, him, or she, her, they, them pronouns. So that's my view on pronouns and why you shouldn't participate in those sort of pronoun sharing rituals. It furthers the ideology, it preys upon people's compassion and ignorance in order to sort of normalize gender ideology so that everyone is now in the practice of sharing pronouns, and it's just kind of what we do. It's just like shaking hands now. And then you're basically just clearing the way for the whole gender ideology just to steamroll right through.
Spoken like a true Virgo.
Of course I would say that, a Virgo would say.
If I may add something to that though, I also think it's a recruitment tactic, because when you get people to say like, I'm she, her, I'm he, him, they may, I would start maybe saying she, her, but then I'll kind of, especially under those conditions of, like the privilege and oppression stuff, all of those pressures, people might actually start thinking, well, am I really a she, her? How does they, them feel? How does this and that feel? So I think it kind of like gets people to kind of question themselves in a way when you mandate everybody to think about what their pronouns are. So I think it's kind of a recruitment tactic.
Interesting. So this isn't directed to anybody, but I'm going to give it to you because you for the medical establishment.
Okay.
How can we, collective parents and gender critical people, convince the American Academy of Pediatrics and the Endocrine Society to follow the science? What's going on with the professional bodies
Yeah,
in medicine?
that's a good question. Has anyone heard of WPATH? WPATH, World Professional Association Transgender Health. That's basically a radical advocacy organization promoting transgenderism. Now they teamed up with the Endocrine Society back in, probably before 2009, but in 2009 they published guidelines for gender incongruence and so forth. A lot of the things that I mentioned, treatments, were in there. The people who are co-authors on that paper were also, they're part of WPATH, they're part of Endocrine Society, so they've weaseled their way into the highest levels of endocrinology, and really all the other associations, American Academy of Pediatrics, Psychiatric, they all, if you look, they all refer back to this particular paper. It was redone in 2017. So it's very difficult. I would love to be able to do something about that. I think, speaking out against WPATH, write the Endocrine Society. Tell them what your concerns are as parents. I think if enough people start saying something, that you may make some inroads.
Helena, this woman asked, or this person asked, yeah, it's a woman, sorry, it says mom. It's a woman, right? As a mom with a daughter who is not yet on social media, how do you recommend I teach her to use it?
That is a difficult question. I think this period where your kid is young is a really good window to have, because you can actually have these kinds of reflections. I do think it kind of depends on the family, and how does your child respond when you enforce certain parental things. Like, what are the strategies that you have seen so far in how to get your child to understand where you're coming from or actually follow your directions? I think that is going to depend on every child, every family, and what the relationship between you and your child looks like. So it might look like, not allowing them to have a phone. It might look like putting restrictions, although I will warn you that they will find a way around all of your restrictions, so that almost doesn't even matter. I think at the end of the day, the most important thing, because when they're young, you might be able to exert parental control over them, but that will only become harder and harder as they grow up and get more crafty with what they're doing and start making friends. And so I think the only real solution is to work on your relationship so that they will be able to come to you when they do encounter things on the internet that make them uncomfortable or make them question themselves. And if they start kind of having thoughts that are confusing or whatever, that they will actually come to you and talk to you. Because I honestly think that while you may be able to set some kinds of restrictions or delay technology use by some amount of time, at some point it's coming, at some point you're going to have to handle it. And the best way to be able to handle that is to kind of inoculate them and already set up a strong foundation where they're able to talk to you and they feel comfortable with you and they trust you, which that's not as easy as just being able to take away their phone, but I think that's the only way.
Colin, how do we make ourselves uncancelable?
Cancelable.
Cancelable.
It's really different for everyone. I was, I think, fortunate in that I started talking about this issue somewhat early, and so when I first left academia, actually, my goal was to be an online fitness and nutrition coach. That was my plan. I left my job as a postdoc, and even though I knew it wasn't a prestigious job, I literally just wanted anything I could do that I would had fully control over, because I wanted to get my career out of the control of a bunch of hiring committees that are going to look at my application and Google me and say, oh, this guy's got a problematic Twitter account and his students are feeling unsafe and they're all that stuff. And luckily, the online magazine Quillette saved me from that. Maybe I would have been really happy as a fitness coach. I don't know. I think I probably would have. But I was able to get that platform for Quillette to sort of keep me in this area of being able to talk about this stuff full time. And over time, I sort of wanted to be someone who talks about this publicly more and more because I think it's really important. But if you're someone who doesn't really necessarily want to be someone who just talks about this 24/7, it might be difficult to find the type of job you can get where you're uncancelable. Basically, you have to be self-employed to a very large degree or part of an organization or have a boss who is very much on your side and you know that they won't succumb to online Twitter mobs or people picketing outside your business or something like that. Quillette was a platform for free speech. That was sort of their philosophy, and so I had no worries whatsoever that my boss was going to fire me for a Twitter mob or anything like this. The last thing they would have done. Same with my position at FAIR right now, and also I have a newsletter, so a Substack that they're strongly committed to free speech. And so my goal is to have multiple streams of income as well, so if any one of them gets shut off at any one point for whatever reason, that I can still persist on 2 different streams. It's not easy, and I don't think everyone can necessarily do it. It's going to depend on the career you're in, and every career is structured differently. So basically, you're going to have to decide for yourself whether this is something you're able to speak really loudly about, and not everyone can or even should, but there's other ways that you can make your voice heard. You can support organizations like FAIR. You can donate to the Heterodox Academy or GenSpect or what are some other organizations that are good on this stuff?
Center for Bioethics and Culture.
Exactly, yeah. Support the organizations that are able to fight those battles, and and if you can, I think a good way to also turn the tides is to show up to the school board, show up to things, and try to vote if you can on any of these types of panels where you have an influence, because the other side, they show up to everything. So if you're not showing up, then you're just relinquishing the battlefield completely. So do your best to get in a place where you don't have someone over you who can take your job away from you, if that's possible, and you want to be speaking about this very publicly.
Can I actually add something to my previous answer about the phones and the parenting? I will say, when your child does get a phone or technology, I would say be involved in knowing what they're doing. Like, treat it like when they're on their phone, they're at somebody else's house. Like, you wouldn't just let your kid go over to some strange person's house. You have no idea who this is, what age this person is, anything about them. Like, you would never do that. But on the internet, they're talking to other people, and they're going to be influenced by other people. So just like know what they're doing, talk to them actually about it, not just monitoring, like actually talk to them. Like, what did you see online today? Like, what accounts do you have? Because like I said, like that younger age, before they've become a bratty ass teenager, that is your chance to set the tone for what does technology use look like in your family? How does your family handle technology? Because I think a lot of parents were really unprepared. They were caught off guard. They were like, oh, what's my kid gonna do? Look at pictures of cats or whatever on the phone. No, they're talking to real people on there, and there's nobody on there protecting them. So like, you need to protect them, and you need to know what they're doing and what they're interested in and who they're talking to, and make that the culture in your family.
Why would injecting testosterone turn Helena's sadness into anger? Why did that happen?
Yeah, I alluded to that a little bit, but I believe it's a direct result of testosterone overdose. You know, we talk a lot about physical aspects of beard growth and all that, but there's dangerous mind conditions that can happen. I was saying like some 10% of anabolic steroid users were found to have psychosis, you know, seeing things that aren't there, talking to satellites and things like that. That's an extreme example of what can happen at these super high, super physiologic doses. So I think that's exactly what happened there. Irritability, hyperactivity, reckless and dangerous behavior. You're already a teen, you're gonna do some reckless and dangerous behavior, and now you're amplifying it.
This is something that we see not just in humans, though. This is I studied animal behavior. We see this in all mammals. If you give them higher doses of testosterone, they get more aggressive. They get bolder. They get more. You can agitate them much more easily. There's similar hormones you can give insects as well that does the same thing. So this shouldn't come as really as a surprise to anyone. I think there is a condition where you can have like an overdose that's different from that. But I mean, we know that testosterone does increase anger and irritability and all these things.
You've heard the term roid rage.
Roid rage, yeah, exactly.
That's effectively what this
Roid
is. It's roid rage.
I had a fungal infection in my hand once. I had to take a series. Oh, sorry, no, it was a autoimmune thing, and I had to take a series of just normal pills for it was a steroid, and it said something like that. And I mean, on there it's just you may become more angry and irritable, and this is just to get rid of a
prednisone can do a similar thing.
Yeah. So we shouldn't be surprised by this.
Now, estrogen, interestingly, a friend of mine now who was on estrogen reported something different. He felt very calm. He felt very kind of in la la land is what he told me until he stopped. A friend of his told him, you should probably stop taking this, it's dangerous. He stopped for a few days and he said he snapped out of it. I was like, I was in a cloud. I always felt good, but then I looked and I realized it was the hormone doing it to me. It's a drug, really. It's a drug of the mind also when taken in those doses.
I've heard that from some of the young men that I know who are detransitioned, where it's like they had a really hard time adjusting in puberty to like all the hormones going on in their bodies. And, it just made them, really, struggle emotionally. And then they got convinced they were trans and took the estrogen. And the fact that the estrogen kind of like sedated them and made them not feel, horny and angry all the time. Like they took that as a sign that they're supposed to be trans. And then they ended up regretting it. But I've heard that from them.
Yeah, makes sense.
It's the opposite too. Some people when they take testosterone, you mentioned they can feel euphoric. It can make them more bold, and they can
more
feel
confident,
and so
more athletic.
They attribute this confidence and this newfound boldness with, I was born in the wrong body. This is the real me, But even though that's just, anyone would feel these types of things if they took testosterone. This isn't evidence that the diagnosis was correct or anything like that.
This is for anybody. When are the lawsuits coming? Not soon enough?
They're happening. I mean, there are some that are going on, but they need to be more frequent. I think there needs to be some sort of like a landmark case that just sets the tone, where it can just be like a domino effect, and we have like once some sort of legal precedent is set that this is not okay and that this is causing harm. Hopefully, you'll get those billboards. Were you harmed by gender ideology? Contact me. I saw a few of those signs on the way for, were you injured in a car accident type of thing.
I would just add that I feel like some detransitioners that I've talked to blame themselves for what happened to such a degree. I'm looking at it differently. I'm blaming the doctors who are doing this, who are in charge. They tend to blame themselves. That's one thing I've seen, and another thing is I think they just want to be over with it. I've lived that. I'm done with it. I don't want to go through a lawsuit, and I think it's a difficult thing.
They know it would mean a lot of publicity and
Publicity.
so much vitriol. And like a lot of the times these are like really vulnerable people who, they've struggled with mental health issues, and now their mental health issues are compounded 1,000 times by the transition regret. So it's like that's the last person who wants to be, taken through the ringer of just like, you know how these trans activists can get, like imagine if like a lawsuit was actually threatening their ability to like do what they do, like they would go crazy. So.
This can be for anybody, but I'll start with you if you want to answer it, Helena. What is understood about what's behind the increase in percentage of young girls seeking this? What's behind it?
I think the social media contagion is definitely the biggest thing. Like it's pretty much all of them are coming from something similar to what I came from. It's like they find these communities online and they want to fit in, and a prerequisite to fitting in is adopting the beliefs of gender ideology. Being trans is like heralded as this amazing thing. You want to be the amazing thing. So you comb through all of your emotional issues and you start interpreting yourself as trans. Like I think that's pretty much kind of the playbook for all of them.
I had posed that question, so I'm answering, is that propensity more likely to happen to a young girl than a young guy? Are there more girls on social media than men?
I think so. I think girls just, especially during adolescence, like there's even research into how rejection sensitive different demographics are, and like teenage girls are known to be the highest like rejection sensitivity of any demographic, and that means that like when you feel socially rejected, your brain literally lights up with a flood of negative emotions.
So it
And
comes down to the old, sex-based differences.
that's the ironic part.
Yeah.
That it's like all these girls who think they're boys, they're going through one of the most female typical phenomenon that has been known in history. Yeah, so I think that's it.
I was going to say, I spoke to one of the middle school, high school coaches about cell phones, and he said, the girls will be on social media for the most part, and the boys are on games.
Yeah.
And I suppose being on games is not the inundation of this trans stuff like there is with social media.
Yeah.
Maybe that's part of it.
And also, like, because I know some detransitioned young men, and so we talk a lot about, like, what was it like for you? And some of them were kind of a little bit more like me, and they, like, went through, like, that Tumblr trajectory, but most of the time, like, they're not, even when they find it online, it's not as much of a social thing. It's more of just a kind of, like, they're just the type of boy who, thinks things really strongly, gets obsessed with things. They find this idea of trans online and they kind of indoctrinate themselves into it. Whereas with the girls, it's very social. So I think that's why like girls especially are vulnerable to it.
Yeah. I think it's similar to like a lot of other social contagion. You had like, anorexia is examples of
Self-harm.
these, and these tend to just spread more like wildfire in young girls than boys, for reasons of sex differences and personality differences. You have different personalities. I think agreeableness is much higher in women on average. Not saying you can't be disagreeable woman, but there are average sex differences, and again, it is kind of ironic that it comes back to this is how it explains general trends.
And those other like socially contagious things that you just mentioned, like the anorexia and the self-harm, they're also like they heavily overlap with the gender dysphoria.
Yeah.
Like I spoke to a woman who's a therapist for eating disorders, and she was telling me about how a quarter of the patients in her eating disorder treatment center, these young adolescent girls, are identifying as trans. And that's one of the most ridiculous things. Is like these eating disorder treatment centers will affirm the girls that they're trans.
Wow.
Like I've had experience with this. I've struggled with an eating disorder in my life, and I've been into a treatment center and they had gender neutral bathrooms in the eating disorder treatment center. And we even had a therapy group all about how where these trans identifying young girls were talking about how transphobia caused their eating disorders, and the therapists are just nodding along like, yeah, that's so true. So it's crazy to me. That's one of the most craziest things, because eating disorders are one of the most well-documented cases of social contagion. Like researchers know that this is social contagion, but like they don't put it together when a quarter of the girls with eating disorders are also transitioning.